Most people, especially those in the mental health field, don't realize that what we often label as personality flaws are really just adaptations to trauma. And understanding how these adaptations show up in our lives is crucial to understanding how trauma fragments the self and why what feels like dysfunction is often just self-protection. If we want to shift from blame to understanding, we must first understand that trauma isn't just about what happened to you. It's about what happened inside of you when something in your life felt overwhelming. Most of the time, when people come to me asking, "Why am I like this?" the answer isn't that something is actually wrong with them. It's actually that something overwhelmed them and their system simply had to learn to adapt. Let me explain. Have you ever felt like there were two versions of you living inside the same body? Like you could be so grounded and logical one moment and then reactive or completely overwhelmed the next? Or like you want so badly a deep connection with others, but then there's this other aspect of you that pulls away when something feels too close? Or like you're confident, extremely confident in one area of your life, but yet deeply insecure in others? Or maybe like certain emotions feel harder to access and so much more difficult to control than other emotions in your life. That internal split that you're feeling is not a flaw. It's also not evidence that something is wrong with you. And it's not immaturity, and it's not weakness. It is simply what happens when parts of you split off in order to survive something that was overwhelming. In psychology, we call this fragmentation. It can show up in so many different ways, not just internal conflict like I explained. It can look like emotional numbness, sudden shifts in mood or behavior, feeling disconnected from parts of your past, feeling competent in one area and inadequate in others, feeling disingenuous in certain situations, having chronic shame towards certain traits of yours, unjustly judging other people, or reacting in ways that feel disproportionate. The word fragmentation actually comes from the Latin root meaning to break into pieces. But psychologically, fragmentation doesn't mean you are broken. It simply means that instead of breaking under pressure, our minds reorganized. Early trauma researchers noticed that when someone goes through something overwhelming, especially when it happens in childhood, parts of our consciousness split off in order to cope. So parts of you step forward while other parts step back because your system is trying to keep you safe and connected. Fragmentation is how the psyche preserves connection when being whole feels unsafe. It's like an adaptation to our environment. So for emphasis, I'm going to say it again. Fragmentation happens when parts of you split off in order to survive an emotionally overwhelming experience. Sometimes that overwhelm is obvious trauma, so maybe growing up with some kind of abuse in the household. Other times it's chronic stress, so growing up in a home where mom and dad are constantly fighting with one another. And sometimes it's more subtle, like growing up in an environment where certain emotions weren't allowed and needs were not met. And this is important to understand because it means that all of us have experienced fragmentation, no matter how well-intentioned our parents were. When being fully yourself threatened connection, your nervous system chose connection while wholeness took the back seat. We must understand that for a child, connection is not optional. Their very survival depends on connection. What that means is that we will abandon aspects of ourselves long before we risk being abandoned by others. So that you understand, I'd like to give you an example of how fragmentation actually occurs. So it could be a child who expresses anger and her parents respond with withdraw or punishment or shame. The nervous system instantly learns that anger threatens her attachment to her parents, so she pushes her anger underground. Then there's another child who learns that achievement brings warmth and approval from her caregivers, so the achiever aspect of her becomes the dominant aspect of her personality, while the messy, uncertain, emotional self fades into the background. Then there's another child who might be told that they're too sensitive growing up, so sensitivity becomes something that they must hide at all costs, and instead, stoicism becomes the dominant aspect of their personality. Then there's another child who might learn that having needs is burdensome, and so she learns hyper-independence is what gains approval and connection. You see, trauma isn't just about what happened to you. It is what your system had to do in order to survive what happened to you. And when survival is at stake, integration is always secondary. So parts of you go into exile or hiding, if you will. So let's talk about why that's a problem. Because fragmentation doesn't just disappear as you grow into an adult. Instead, it shows up in a whole bunch of different ways. So it could be self-sabotage. It could be emotionally shut down. It could be overachievement or push and pull dynamics in relationships, or feeling confident in one area but deeply, deeply insecure in others. Maybe it's feeling ashamed of certain emotions that you have, or feeling like you have to edit yourself depending on who you're around. There are so many more ways that fragmentation can show up, but the point is that fragmentation feels like a contradiction, but it's actually an incredibly intelligent design around survival. So if you recognize these parts in yourself, so maybe it's the anxious one, or the avoidant one, or the controlling one, or the people pleaser, that recognition is proof that your system learned the best way it knew how to survive. Sometimes when we realize these adaptations, our instinct is to want to get rid of those parts. But I must be clear that the goal is never, ever to get rid of those parts. It is simply to understand them. And I'm going to explain why. Because when parts of you get rejected, disowned, pushed away, they don't disappear. They go into the shadow. But the shadow is not this evil place like some spiritual traditions teach. It's simply the parts of you that you learned were unacceptable for the culture in which you were raised. Better put, Carl Jung described the shadow as the aspects of ourselves that we repress in order to maintain our sense of self. What we exile doesn't just stay quiet. It actually just resurfaces in distorted ways. So the anger you weren't allowed to express often shows up as passive aggression, or the needs that you were shamed for show up as controlling others, or the fear that you weren't allowed to feel shows up as avoidance, and maybe the vulnerability you buried shows up as emotional distance. You see, the shadow isn't something dark that lives inside of you, lurking around to cause harm, as so many people describe it. It's actually the part of you that was unloved. And when we reject those parts, we often experience that rejection as shame. And if you want to learn more about shame, you can watch my video titled The Psychology of Shame, and I'll link it in the description for you. When those rejected parts of you operate unconsciously, they absolutely can cause harm to ourselves and to others, but not because they're bad. It's because they're unintegrated. The damage isn't from having anger, it's from having unacknowledged anger. Integration doesn't mean indulging in every impulse that comes over us. It means bringing those shadowed parts into our awareness so they don't have to surface in our reactions. Fragmentation is not healed by rising above yourself. It is healed by turning toward the parts of you that you had to adapt. That is why therapy can be so healing for people, because for many, it is the only place they feel safe enough to express and explore those hidden parts. Now, I must say it again for emphasis. Healing is not detaching from your emotions. It is integrating them so that you can experience your emotions fully without being consumed by them. You can never transcend what you have not integrated. So many people struggle to heal because they skip this step. Healing is not becoming someone new. It's also not eliminating more aspects of yourself. It's not suppressing what feels inconvenient. Healing is about integration. It's turning toward the parts of you that had to split off in order to survive. Trauma is what happens inside of you when something overwhelms your nervous system's ability to cope. When that overwhelm is too much to process, the psyche adapts by splitting off parts in order to survive and maintain connection to others. That is what fragmentation is. Healing can only happen when those parts can safely come back into relationship with each other. When those parts can come back into relationship with each other, that is true integration. Here's what I mean. Integration is reclaiming your anger, but not letting it run your life. It's reclaiming vulnerability without drowning in it. It's reclaiming the needs of yours that were unmet without collapsing into them. Fragmentation was necessary because you were protecting yourself. But survival is not the same thing as wholeness. And wholeness only becomes possible when every part of you no longer has to go into hiding. Integration is the process of allowing all of you to exist. Survival required fragmentation because you were protecting yourself. But now, as an adult, your healing depends on your ability to integrate those disowned aspects of you. To end today, I want to say one last thing about integration. The nervous system fragments to preserve connection, and it heals the same way, in safe connection with other people. That is why therapy can be so powerful. Not because someone fixes you, but because someone helps you feel safe enough to let all of you exist. This kind of work rarely happens through willpower alone. So whether it's in therapy or in a deeply trusted relationship, do not attempt it in isolation. Fragmentation is a relational wound, and it heals in relationship. At the end of the day, every relationship begins with the relationship we have with ourselves. Integration is learning how to relate to all of your parts without rejecting them further. Because when you no longer have to hide from yourself, you no longer have to hide in your relationships. And as always, stay curious about the parts of you that show up. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.